White granulated sugar. Nearly every sweet thing you've ever eaten owes its baseline to this exact crystal, and almost none of it looks anything like the plant it actually came from. We'll get to what that original plant looks like shortly, because it's nothing like a white crystal. This is white granulated sugar, the most common form of sugar on the planet, refined down from either sugarcane or sugar beets into pure sucrose crystals. That heavy refining is exactly why it tastes clean and uniformly sweet, with none of the earthy or mineral notes you'll hear about later in this video. That refining process strips out molasses and most naturally occurring minerals along the way, a detail worth holding on to because it explains a lot once we compare these sugars side by side later on. Sugar's actual origin story starts in India thousands of years ago, where sugarcane was first processed into a solid, storable form. From there it spread outward through centuries of trade, eventually becoming the dominant sweetener in kitchens worldwide. In the UK and US today, white granulated sugar remains the standard, the default sweetener behind most household baking and the overwhelming majority of manufactured food products. But that refining process strips something out, and it turns out you can just put it right back in. The very next sugar on this list is proof of exactly that. Brown sugar. Brown sugar isn't a separate crop or a different plant at all. It's white sugar with the molasses stripped out earlier, added directly back in. Light brown sugar gets a smaller amount folded back in. Dark brown sugar gets considerably more, which is exactly why it carries a noticeably deeper, more caramel-like flavor and holds onto more moisture. That reintroduced molasses is doing more than flavoring the sugar. It's also why brown sugar behaves so differently in your pantry. Leave it exposed to air, and that same moisture evaporates, which is exactly why brown sugar famously turns into a rock-hard block if it isn't sealed properly. Worth knowing too, not every brown sugar on a shelf is made this way. Raw, less refined varieties like turbinado, demerara, and muscovado skip the add the molasses back in step entirely. Their color and flavor come from molasses that was never fully removed from the cane in the first place. That richer flavor and higher moisture content is exactly why bakers reach for brown sugar, specifically in cookies and sauces. Anywhere a recipe benefits from real depth rather than clean, neutral sweetness. Across the UK and US, it's widely available, and plenty of home cooks actually prefer it over plain white sugar, purely for the flavor difference. Every sugar so far, though, has come from processing the same one or two plants, sugarcane or sugar beets. What's coming next doesn't come from a stalk or a root at all. It's tapped directly from a flower. Coconut sugar. Coconut sugar comes from an entirely different part of the plant than you'd expect. Not the fruit, but the sap tapped from the flowers of the coconut palm. That sap gets collected and boiled down, and because the process stays fairly minimal compared to industrial refining, coconut sugar actually retains a portion of its natural nutrients along with a distinctive caramel-like flavor. Visually, it's easy to mistake for brown sugar, light brown, similar-sized crystals, though the two come from completely different plants and completely different processes. It's also gained a reputation as the health-conscious choice, largely because it tests with a slightly lower glycemic index than white sugar. That's a real measurable difference, but it's still fundamentally sugar, and the gap is smaller than the marketing around it often suggests. You'll find it fairly widely stocked in UK and US health food stores at this point, though it still costs noticeably more than a standard bag of white sugar. Coconut sugar might be pricier than white sugar, but it's nowhere close to the most expensive natural sugar on this list. The next one requires boiling down an enormous volume of raw liquid just to produce a single cup of usable sugar. Maple sugar. Maple sugar starts as maple sap, thin, watery, barely sweet on its own, and gets boiled down relentlessly until every trace of water evaporates, leaving behind nothing but pure, crystallized maple sugar. The ratio involved is almost absurd. Producers typically need somewhere in the range of 40 gallons of raw sap just to produce a single gallon of syrup, and solid maple sugar means boiling that syrup down even further. That's exactly why this ranks among the more expensive sugars on this entire list. What you get for that effort is a rich, unmistakable maple flavor that no other sugar on this list can replicate, because no other sugar comes from this specific tree. It's concentrated almost entirely in North America, the US and Canada in particular, where it shows up in baking as a topping in its own right, and in gourmet recipes specifically built around showcasing that distinctive taste rather than hiding it. Every sugar covered so far, no matter how it's processed, ultimately comes from a plant. The next one doesn't come from a plant at all. It comes from an insect, and it might be the oldest sweetener human beings have ever used. Honey. Honey breaks the pattern completely. It's not extracted, refined, or boiled down from a plant. It's produced by bees, who collect nectar from flowers and transform it, inside the hive, into the thick golden liquid we actually eat. Chemically, it's a mix of fructose and glucose, along with small amounts of vitamins, minerals, and antioxidants. And because different regions and flowers produce different nectar, honey's flavor and color shift dramatically depending entirely on where it was made. Raw honey, left unpasteurized and unfiltered, holds onto more of those beneficial compounds than the clear, shelf-stable pasteurized honey most people actually buy. You've probably also heard that local honey helps with seasonal allergies. It's a claim repeated constantly across the UK and US. Worth knowing though, the science behind that specific claim is much shakier than the popularity of the advice suggests. It's more persistent folklore than settled research. What isn't in dispute is honey's age. It's genuinely one of the oldest sweeteners in human history, used by people long before sugarcane refining or maple tapping existed at all. Honey earns its natural reputation honestly, straight from the hive. The next sweetener on this list markets itself using that exact same word, but the nutritional reality sitting behind that marketing might genuinely surprise you. Agave nectar. Agave nectar comes from the same plant used to make tequila, though the two products are processed in completely different directions. What gets extracted for agave nectar is a syrup unusually high in fructose, high enough that agave often ends up more fructose-dense than even the high-fructose corn syrup it's frequently marketed as a natural alternative to. That's part of its appeal in practical use. A mild flavor that dissolves instantly with none of the graininess of crystallized sugar, which is exactly why it took off as a natural sweetener option through the 2000s and 2010s. But that same concentrated fructose content is precisely where the health concerns start. Consumed in large amounts, high fructose sweeteners like agave have been linked to the same metabolic concerns associated with other heavily fructose-based products, which somewhat undercuts the healthy alternative branding it built its reputation on. You'll still find it stocked across nearly every supermarket in the UK and US, usually sitting right alongside honey and maple syrup, despite behaving nutritionally more like something from a completely different category. If concentrated fructose is the actual concern with agave, there's a sweetener made from something you could genuinely just eat on its own, whole, with no processing required at all. Date sugar and date syrup. Date sugar is exactly what it sounds like: whole dried dates, ground down into a coarse, granulated sugar. Date syrup takes a different path, concentrating date juice down into a thick, pourable liquid. Both versions hold onto the natural fiber and nutrients present in the original fruit, because neither one involves stripping anything out the way white sugar refining does. There's a practical catch with date sugar specifically though, because it's genuinely just ground fruit, rather than true crystallized sugar. It doesn't dissolve well in liquids at all. It sits at the bottom of a drink instead of disappearing into it, which is exactly why it performs best baked directly into something rather than stirred into anything liquid. Date syrup carries none of that limitation, and it's long been a staple of Middle Eastern cooking, known there as Ceylan, used the way honey or maple syrup gets used elsewhere. It's now steadily gaining ground across the UK and US too, marketed specifically as a less processed, whole food alternative to refined sugar. Every single sweetener covered up to this point has calories, because every one of them is, chemically, some form of actual sugar. Artificial and low-calorie sweeteners. This entire category exists for one specific purpose: sweetness without the calories that come attached to actual sugar. But it's not one single thing. It's several, genuinely different technologies grouped under one umbrella. Stevia and monk fruit are both plant-derived, extracted from leaves and fruit respectively, which is exactly why they've become the go-to choice for people specifically trying to avoid sugar while staying closer to something natural. Aspartame and sucralose sit at the other end of the spectrum entirely, fully synthetic compounds engineered in a lab, and the backbone of most diet sodas and sugar-free products on the market. Erythritol falls somewhere in between, a sugar alcohol that occurs naturally in small amounts in some fruits, though what's actually sold in stores is almost always produced industrially. What unites all of them is close to 0 calories, but that's about where the similarities stop. Aspartame, for instance, breaks down under sustained heat, which is exactly why it rarely gets recommended for baking. Sucralose holds up fine under the same conditions, and stevia, for many people, carries a faint bitter or licorice-like aftertaste that erythritol and monk fruit tend to avoid. With 10 wildly different sweeteners now on the table, the obvious next question is which one is actually the healthiest choice? And the honest answer turns out to be more complicated than picking a single winner. Nutrition and health comparison. Here's where all 10 of these sweeteners actually get compared side by side. Every caloric sugar on this list, white, brown, coconut, maple, honey, agave, date, delivers roughly the same 4 calories per gram, regardless of how it's marketed or what it costs. Calorically, they're far closer to each other than the packaging would ever suggest. The real differences show up elsewhere: how quickly each one raises blood sugar and what, if anything, comes along for the ride besides sweetness. Remember that refining process from earlier, the one that strips out molasses and minerals from white sugar? This is exactly why honey, date sugar, and coconut sugar test higher on retained minerals and antioxidants than plain white sugar. Less processing left more behind. It's genuinely there, though still in modest amounts, compared to what you'd get from actual whole foods. And remember agave's concentrated fructose content? This is exactly the caution flag being raised here. High fructose options like agave are the ones nutritionists watch most closely, particularly when consumed in large, regular amounts. The honest, unavoidable bottom line covers every single sugar on this list, no exceptions. Excessive consumption of any of them, however it's sourced or marketed, is linked to real health issues. Knowing the nutritional trade-offs is one thing. Knowing which sugar to actually reach for in your own kitchen for which recipe is the part that trips up even experienced home bakers. How to choose, use, and store sugar. So here's the practical version. Reach for white sugar whenever a recipe needs clean, neutral sweetness without any competing flavor. Most baking, most beverages, anywhere sugar's only job is to be sweet and nothing else. Reach for brown sugar or coconut sugar when you actually want flavor working alongside the sweetness. That caramel depth changes cookies, sauces, and glazes in a way plain white sugar can't. Honey and maple sugar are for moments where the sweetener's own distinct character is meant to be the point, not hidden behind other ingredients. Storage is where a lot of good sugar quietly goes to waste. Keep everything in airtight containers. This matters even more for brown sugar and any moisture-retaining variety, since exposure to air is exactly what turns them into a hardened block. And the same rule that's applied throughout this entire series applies here too. Buy your everyday sugar in bulk, but buy the specialty varieties, maple, date syrup, the rarer options, in small quantities, and use them specifically where their unique flavor actually gets to shine, rather than burying them in a recipe where nobody will notice the difference. 10 sweeteners, 10 genuinely different roles in your kitchen, and now you know exactly which one earns its place in which recipe. If this changed the way you'll shop for sugar, hit subscribe, and tell us in the comments which one you're trying next.